Described. More on this in the Learning Curve in half an hour. But first, 1968, Rivers of Blood, the Real Source. Robert Shepherd presents the first programme in a major new Radio 4 series on the momentous events of 1968.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
Enoch Powell, 40 years ago this spring, repeating a comment by one of his Wolverhampton constituents.
Well, I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? My answer is that I do not have the right not to do so.
Unlike the Archbishop of Canterbury speaking recently about Sharia law, Powell set out to shock. His Rivers of Blood speech, as it's known, is one of the most explosive in living memory by a British politician. It ended Powell's career as a front-bench politician, but made him a folk hero for many. For many others, Powell became a figure of hate.
And just by me on the opposite side to Downing Street, which is blocked by at least a cordon of 50 policemen, are the anti-Powellites. You can hear them booing in the background.
Although Powell never achieved the highest offices of state, his 1968 speech still carries an explosive charge. Only last autumn, Nigel Hastellow, a Conservative candidate in the West Midlands, wrote in his newspaper column that Powell had been right. Mr. Hastellow was condemned by senior Tories and resigned. Immigration was, and still is, a highly sensitive issue, but Powell went out of his way to provoke.
The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm and of resentment lie not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder.
The legislation referred to by Powell was a new race relations bill that MPs were due to debate a few days later. But Powell's motives for being so outspoken are still hotly debated. Some people regard him simply as a racist, others as honestly reflecting the views of his constituents. This programme will explore what exactly was in Enoch Powell's mind, and we will trace the source of Powell's Rivers of Blood to his wartime service in India and to his burning ambition to be Viceroy of India and follow in the footsteps of the illustrious Victorians and Edwardians who had held that office.
He's very much in the mould, really, of someone like Lord Ripon, a kind of liberal sahib being brought into the 1960s. It's almost like a dinosaur appearing from another time.
Peter Brook, the Cambridge historian, who will give new insight into Powell's ideas. Before Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech, he confided in a close friend, Clem Jones, editor of Wolverhampton's Express and Star newspaper. His son is Nick Jones, the political reporter.
And on the Thursday before the speech, Clem, my father, was having this conversation with Enoch in the front room of our house in Westland Avenue in Wolverhampton. And what Enoch said to my father was that, look, you know that when a rocket goes up in the sky and the stars usually fall back to Earth, well, on this occasion, my speech is going to be such that when it explodes up in the air, the stars are going to stay up there for quite a long time.
Clem Jones had taught Powell how to publicise his speeches, but Powell went to extraordinary lengths to keep his Rivers of Blood speech secret beforehand from his fellow Conservatives. Powell was to address members of the West Midlands Conservative Political Centre at the Midland Hotel, now the Burlington, in New Street, Birmingham, on Saturday the 20th of April 1968. The meeting was chaired by Sir Reginald Eyre, then MP for Birmingham Hall Green and Conservative Whip for the West Midlands.
I didn't know that Enoch had put out a speech. I just didn't know. So I said to the secretary, what subject did you ask Mr. Powell to speak on?
He said, oh, we asked him to speak about the future of government.
Even over lunch with a few party officials immediately before the meeting, Powell kept mum about the political rocket he was about to launch.
Enoch spoke throughout the meal very strongly about economics and, in particular, prices and incomes policy. And I was quite sure he's going to speak about that at the meeting afterwards.
Reg Eyre only realised that something was up just before the meeting when the secretary checked that the room was ready.
And he came down and told me the cameras were being installed and that one of the operators had told him that Enoch had handed out a speech earlier.
Only a few highlights were recorded for the news. The speech immediately became known as the Rivers of Blood because of the following words spoken here by actor John Rowe.
As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood.
The quotation was a very dramatic moment and had an effect upon the audience. The audience was slightly stunned. There was a distinct feeling in my mind that we were all surprised by the way it happened, by the way the quotation came into the speech.
As soon as the speech was over, Reg Eyre rushed to warn his boss.
I had to go off to telephone the Chief Whip, Willie Whitelaw, to tell him of the attendance of this great number of cameras, and to say to him that I had no doubt that the speech would attract a very great deal of attention the next morning. He's a good old experienced politician, and asked just 2 or 3 quick questions, and thanked me for telephoning to let him know.
So this was the first he'd heard about it?
Yes, yes.
Powell quickly discovered that his rocket was already making a bigger impact than even he expected, and was to transform his whole life. Nick Jones.
That Saturday afternoon, my mother and father were looking after Powell's 2 daughters, Susan and Jennifer. They were at my parents' home. They'd been left off there when Powell and Pam went to the speech. Now, when Enoch Powell came back to pick up the children, my mother and father had been reading the speech, and my mother had been shocked at the language. She'd been shocked in particular at the phrases that Powell had used about grinning pickaninnies, about how there was a little old lady who'd had excrement pushed through the letterbox. Now, my mother was a very principled woman, and she said to my father, look, we can't have a friendship with someone like this. My father said he funked it, and when Powell came back to the door, my mother went to the door and said to Enoch, I'm afraid I don't think we're going to be able to see you for a very long time. And Powell said to her, well, does that mean it's an end of a friendship? And my mother said, yes, it is.
Powell's speech was the lead story on the news. There's no recording of the 10 o'clock bulletin, but here's that evening's newsreader with his script.
This is BBC Radio 4, the Home Service. Here is the news, read by Brian Perkins. Mr. Enoch Powell, likening the Race Relations Bill to a match thrown onto gunpowder, says that immigration should be virtually stopped. The minister responsible for race relations has called Mr. Powell's speech extremely damaging.
Powell's speech was splashed across the Sunday papers. On Radio 4's The World This Weekend, Powell maintained that he'd simply been stating party policy.
Indeed, I repeatedly pointed out that the 3 elements of policy round which my speech was built, the prevention of numbers increasing further by inflow, the encouragement of maximum re-emigration, and the genuinely like treatment before the law of all in this country. Our official Conservative Party, Mr. Heath, has stated them over and over and over again.
This didn't wash with Powell's senior colleagues, the Shadow Home Secretary Quintin Hogg, later Lord Hailsham, and the Shadow Chancellor Ian MacLeod. Here's Jim, now Lord Prior, who was Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Conservative leader, Edward Heath.
On the Sunday, I spoke to Ted Heath, and by then it was quite clear that both Quintin Hogg and Ian MacLeod would resign if Enoch remained a member of the Shadow Cabinet.
Hogg and MacLeod were furious, because Powell had not raised a word of dissent 10 days earlier when the Shadow Cabinet adopted a policy of measured opposition to the government's race relations bill. Simon Heffer is Powell's biographer.
I'm absolutely sure that Powell did say nothing. I went and looked in the papers in the Bodleian Library, where all the Shadow Cabinet papers now are, and indeed I couldn't find a record of him saying anything about this at all. But you see, Enoch had been pretty quiet on most things in Shadow Cabinet because he was always in the minority of one. Even people that one would have thought he'd had a fellow feeling with, like Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher, were in those days absolutely, totally Heathite.
Here was someone who was meant to be a colleague and just landed his colleagues in a very difficult situation and did it deliberately. And he knew it was going to cause an enormous amount of trouble, and he was happy that it did.
Jim Pryor. On the Sunday evening, Heath sacked Powell.
I told Mr. Powell that he could not remain a member of the Shadow Cabinet because of the inflammatory nature of his speech at Birmingham. I considered that this was likely to make racial relations more difficult.
Did Powell expect the sack? Simon Heffer.
I don't know whether he thought he would get away with it. I think he felt it was a chance worth taking. By the spring of 1968, when this speech was made, he was at war with Heath on so many big issues, on so many fronts. I think that he was now setting out deliberately to provoke him. And I don't think that Enoch was lying. Enoch never lied, that he wanted to make this speech because it was of constituency importance to him. He also, I think, wanted to make this speech because he wanted to provoke Heath. And having provoked Heath and having been sent out of the Shadow Cabinet, he was then able to plough his own furrow as a Conservative. And I think that he was always much happier doing that than he was being in the Shadow Cabinet.
London dockers and Smithfield meat porters marched on Westminster in an extraordinary display of solidarity with a Tory politician. Support among whites in Powell's Wolverhampton constituency was overwhelming.
So Enoch Powell made a speech, and everybody in power turned around and said, Enoch Powell's a bum, he's a racialist, he's against the coloureds, and they piled it on. But the man in the street came out, and it's the man in the street who sees this. And he turned round, he called a mass strike. They marched on Parliament. They sent in petitions. Factories have gone on strike. Factories are going on strike. Why? Because free speech has been blinking well stifled. And Enoch Powell has brought it out.
Powell received over 100,000 letters. Only about 800 disagreed with him. Petitions of support arrived at his home.
88% of Slough people say they support Enoch Powell. 88%.
Because Powell had been widely respected for his integrity, his Rivers of Blood speech took a fearful toll on immigrants. Bill, now Lord Morris, who had left Jamaica 14 years earlier, was a young shop steward in a Birmingham engineering factory. He recalls the different reactions between other dramatic events in 1968 and Powell's speech.
When Martin Luther King was assassinated, or when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, you went into work and there were groups of people ready and willing, volunteering a point of view to talk. Who killed it? What a tragedy, what a tremendous loss to the world and world peace and American society. We got all that. But on this occasion, nobody wanted to have a conversation. People that you had worked with, people who were your mates that you socialized with at work, they suddenly found a lot of interest in looking on the floor rather than looking you in the eyes.
Powell had confirmed this woman's worst suspicions.
Well, I think for the first time we've had the true reaction. The British have always felt this way, and I think it's time that it came out in the open. I've always known it.
Do you agree with the reaction of the dockers?
No, not at all, but I think it's an honest reaction, and I expected it. I've always known the British were like this.
But after the speech in our inner city areas, you wasn't quite sure who to trust, and people start looking over their shoulders. Youngsters start going out in groups, because one or two teddy boys in the Midlands, they thought it was fun to gang up and try and create a little bit of interest in taking on a few fights with black youngsters.
Bill Morris. Powell had given succour to racists, but the charge of racism against Powell cannot be reconciled with another dramatic speech he made 9 years earlier. In July 1959, MPs debated the beating and murder of Africans detained at Hola Camp in British-ruled Kenya. Powell's attack on the Conservative government was more scathing than those made by Labour MPs. Commons proceedings were not recorded at the time, so Powell's words are spoken by John Rowe.
We cannot say we will have African standards in Africa, Asian standards in Asia, and perhaps British standards here at home. We have not that choice to make.
But why did Powell crank up the rhetoric on immigration in the late 1960s? What drove him to lob extreme comments from his constituents into the public domain like verbal hand grenades? Here's Richard Ritchie, who began working for Powell in 1969 and became a close family friend.
The reason he made the speech was because he genuinely believed that this was a problem which was growing in intensity, which was threatening all that he most believed in. Immigration struck at the heart of what he entered politics for. The character of the country, its common sense of loyalty, the Queen, the established church, all the things that he cared most about. Uncontrolled immigration at the pace and the extent to which it was happening threatened all that, and therefore, even if he had thought it was politically inopportune, he would still have said it, in my view.
Powell represented a town with a growing immigrant community, but the rest of the country seemed oblivious to the impact. At nearby Walsall, 2 months before his Rivers of Blood speech, Powell had made his frustration explicit. His words are spoken by John Rowe.
There is a sense of hopelessness and helplessness which comes over persons who are trapped or imprisoned when all their efforts to attract attention and assistance bring no response. This is the kind of feeling which you in Walsall and we in Wolverhampton are experiencing in the face of the continued flow of immigration into our towns.
He was being bombarded with complaints from constituents who were worried about the fact that they'd never been consulted about this enormous demographic change that was going on. And also because I think he realised that the very coherence and unity of the nation he loved so much was under threat from this. And I think that by 1967-68, it was becoming so obvious to him that he knew he had to speak out about it.
Simon Heffer. In November 1967, Powell visited America for the first time and was appalled at the devastation caused by the summer race riots. His fear that Britain was heading in the same direction prompted his River Tiber warning. John Rowe reads Powell's words.
That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic, but which there is interwoven with the history and existence of the States itself, is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect.
At the same time as Powell visited America, Kenyan Asians were fleeing to Britain because they were being forced to leave by President Kenyatta. More than 150,000 Kenyan Asians held British passports, raising the prospect of further mass immigration. These events prompted Powell to up the ante on immigration in early 1968. A revealing comment in his Walsall speech provides the final clue to the source of the Rivers of Blood. Referring to a dispute between Sikhs who worked on Wolverhampton's buses and the corporation, Powell said this. His words are read by John Rowe.
We have just been seeing in Wolverhampton the cloud no bigger than a man's hand in the shape of communalism. Communalism has been the curse of India, and we need to be able to recognise it when it rears its head here.
What did Powell mean by communalism and the curse of India? Powell's private papers are held at the Churchill Archives Centre at Cambridge, and I went to see what answers they might hold. There I met Peter Brooke, the Cambridge historian, who has studied Powell's papers. Peter, there are some documents here dating back to the 1940s where Enoch Powell is writing about his time in India and about his views on India. Can you just explain what these papers are?
So what we've got here is a report written by Powell in November 1945, while he was still in Delhi. He just spent a few years in India initially working for the Joint Intelligence Committee there during the war, and then after the war he'd spent a year doing a tour of the country looking at the future of the Indian Army and how that should be reordered as part of a post-war imperial India. And whilst doing that, he began to develop ideas about the future of India in general, and especially what form of government would be best suited to India. And he makes a couple of very interesting observations that chime quite strongly with what he later says about immigration to Britain in the 1960s. And he uses a word which appears in the Rivers of Blood speech and various other speeches from 68, namely communal. And in the report he says that the Indian parties at this time are, to quote, all communal, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, untouchable, and other minorities. So he's really making an argument for India being totally dominated by group identities.
Powell believed that the strength of group identities, or communalism, in India in the 1940s made it impossible for democracy to work there in the foreseeable future. In his view, communalism prevented people taking rational decisions as individual voters and then accepting the majority verdict when they were in a minority.
It's that fear of the mixture of irrationality and democracy that Powell carries right through till the 1960s and onwards, and really lies at the heart of his Rivers of Blood speech.
Powell left India in early 1946 and began working at the Conservative Parliamentary Secretariat. Later that year he completed a major study of how India could be kept and run within the empire. But he was totally opposed to any migration from India to Britain.
He is not happy with the idea of a significant flow of Commonwealth migrants into Britain, and he sees it as being dangerous on the grounds that Britain would no longer be the homogeneous national electorate that he perceived it to be at that time in 1946.
The following year, Attlee's Labour government pushed ahead with Indian independence. Powell's papers show that he was receiving vivid reports that confirmed all his worst fears about communalism.
In fact, at this time he was in contact with a couple of people he'd known in the army from his time out in India, who were writing to him regularly during the course of the partition. And it's very clear that the message he's getting from his contacts is that what is happening here is an absolute explosion of communal violence, that people have been given democracy in India far too early, in his opinion, and that they are taking their future into their own hands through the means of violence and bloodshed to a horrific level, and not actually operating democracy in the way that it was intended.
Among the documents is a file of papers marked confidential.
These are the reports which were government official reports from the Punjab during 1947 on the situation, the social situation in the run-up towards partition.
So they're leaks. They're leaked to him. He's no longer working for the government. He's in the opposition.
That's right, yes. They've been sent by a contact of Powell in the Punjab.
Powell's contact has written the word appeasement on an official report from Lahore in March 1947. At the end, he adds the following Latin saying:
Quem Deus vult perdere prius dementat, which translates as those who the gods would like to destroy, they first make mad.
Now, when did we hear that again?
That wasn't heard until the Rivers of Blood speech, where he talks about communal violence in Britain, or the prospect of communal violence, drawing a very chilling parallel back to the violence of partition India.
Yes, that phrase is often quoted from that speech, and here it is, written on a leaked report to him about the build-up of the violence on Indian independence.
Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad. Literally mad. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
The contact who scrawled the Latin phrase used more than 20 years later by Powell was Frank Brain, a former official in the Indian Civil Service. In late August 1947, shortly after independence, Brain forwarded a letter he'd received from an Indian who despaired at the communal violence sweeping his country and at the British government's failure to prevent it.
All this happened when His Majesty's government was busy transferring power to Indian hands. The administrative machinery broke down completely. People died like flies, but nobody took any notice of them. Whitehall forgot to carry out its pledges to the minorities and to the dumb and driven millions. We sent cable after cable to all the important leaders of Great Britain, but all in vain. The British were no longer interested in maintaining peace and order. Perhaps they were incapable of doing so. On the 15th of August came freedom, the freedom to burn, loot, and murder.
These appalling images of communal violence were to haunt Powell for the rest of his life. The connection in Powell's mind between events in India in the 1940s and the rivers of blood in 1968 is confirmed by a letter he wrote to the Bishop of Lichfield in 1955. Peter Brook.
To that extent, this letter is really the kind of missing link between the ideas conceived in the mind of the imperialist in 1946 when he's writing about India, and then the kind of post-imperialist Powell of 1968. He's rejected empire by then, and passionately anti-immigration, both in 47, 46 and 1968.
Bus drivers in West Bromwich, next door to Powell's constituency, had gone on strike because the corporation had employed an Indian bus conductor. Local bishops condemned the strikers, but Powell privately rebuked his diocesan bishop.
Where any considerable part of a population has distinctive characteristics, I believe that the working of institutions such as ours cannot fail to be endangered. However wrong-headedly and gropingly, I believe the strikers in West Bromwich to have apprehended the dangers for this country of any appreciable coloured population becoming domiciled here.
What's clear is that in 1955, in fact, even though Powell is not making mention of this issue in public, he is nevertheless passionately angry about it in private, and it is something which bugs him.
Peter Brook. Powell never got over his despair at events in India in the 1940s. To his horror, he thought that Britain was importing the potential for bloody violence with large-scale immigration from the West Indies and Asia in the 1950s and 1960s. It also explains Powell's deep-dyed scepticism of almost anything Whitehall said, not only on immigration, but also on economic intervention, the nuclear deterrent, Europe, and devolution in Ulster. An institution that had washed its hands of India and condemned its people to arson, looting and murder was capable of anything.
1968, Rivers of Blood, The Real Source, was presented and produced by Robert Shepherd. More educational issues in the learning curve in a few moments.
At the beginning of the 20th century, America had no federal law enforcement agency. But with the birth of the car, the aeroplane and the telephone, cross-border crime increased. So 100 years ago, the FBI was formed. BBC Radio 4 hears about the agency, its agents and its leaders, including the legendary J. Edgar Hoover.
All of us were provided 2 handkerchiefs, one to put in our pocket of our suit and the other to dry our hands before we shook the director's hand. He did not like a sweaty palm.
The FBI at 100 is every afternoon this week at 3:45, or you can hear the omnibus edition on Friday night at 9 o'clock.